We come now to exploring a case study. As I said, this will be part of each week during the course of this module, and I'm very grateful to a group of the full-time candidates who are training down in Cardiff for coming to do this for real this afternoon. This is not rehearsed. This is as it will be in your own individual groups. This will just help to model what it is to do that theological reflection. The case study that we have got this afternoon is a particularly complex one. You will be pleased to know that the ones in the course are not as complex as this. This one is more complex because it helps us to pull out those themes which we talked about earlier, and because this group of candidates have studied pastoral practice to level 5 and have had considerable experience in the field and have been on the pastoral residential strand of the St Padans weekends. So our case study this afternoon revolves around a man called Alan. It's a man in his 40s who has had a horrendous accident 6 months ago. He is a professional pilot and he was flying solo in a small plane. He had to make an emergency landing as the engine burst into flames. He made an intentional decision to avoid a housing estate that resulted in very difficult access for emergency services to reach him. He was severely burned and is very disfigured. The burns unit have never treated such a severely injured patient who has survived this long. His mother is a member of your congregation. She was divorced some years ago. She is adamant that her son is coming to live with her when he is eventually discharged. She asks that you go to visit Alan, although she's not sure that Alan is a person of faith. And Alan is okay with you visiting. The sister of the burns unit asks to speak with you before you go into Alan's room. She expresses major concerns that the unit has with Alan's mother, who presents as always dissatisfied, always complaining about something, and very controlling. They do not think this is a helpful environment for Alan to continue his rehabilitation upon eventual discharge from the unit. With all this information, you go and visit Alan. The conversation focuses around the fact that he is still staring death in the face. His most significant comment to you is that I have been to hell. So the first task is to honestly name your initial feelings, thoughts and questions on reading the case study.
It's deeply shocking, and I think the tension for me as sort of going into it is between our pastoral care of the mother and our pastoral care of the son. And it's not an unusual situation, but it is confusing, and I'm full of conflicting feelings having first heard it of what I would do next.
Okay, yeah.
I think I would want to continue that idea of conflicting feelings about what I would do next, but what the people in that situation are expecting, are feeling, and really my initial feeling is, where do you start?
Mm-hmm. Mm. What were others feeling?
I'm very aware that you've got both the sister from the unit and the mother, who clearly have Alan's best intentions at heart and are very passionate. But on the one hand, you've got a sort of a healthcare professional who has sort of realistic expectations of the care that he needs. And on the other, it just sounds like a mum who's very, very deeply disturbed because her son has been so incredibly damaged and hurt. And so somehow reconciling those two things, where they both have the same intention, but the ways they're going about it are so incredibly different, and somehow being able to reconcile those.
I'm struck by the sort of the core stuff that makes this up, but there's a lot of stuff going on around the periphery, like the conditions of his accident, situations of those around him that are going to impact into it, which just makes it more complicated.
It's incredibly sad. There's no, whatever Alan do and his mum did, there's no happy ending really here, is there? There's just the next step, just coping with their lives, really.
So we've got a sense of being shocked. Can you say a bit more about what the shock was about?
I think the sort of horror of the accident and exactly what Kerry said, what does healing and hope look like for this man who suffered this horrific accident? And for me, those last couple of lines of the case study, his words to you about staring death in the face and feeling like he's been to hell, and trying to work out actually what does healing look like for someone whose whole life is physically and literally scarred by this experience. That's where the shock for me was so vivid.
Yeah, that's well identified. Kerry, do you want to say a bit more about the sadness?
Yeah, I think I was looking, well, I suppose as a mum, and as a mum of adult children, that to me what stands out first is more her pain. The fact that she can't do what she feels. It's that word adamant in the that she's angry. She's so angry this has happened. She's feeling upset, and I know that we try and protect our kids from everything, and the fact that he is like this, and she feels out of control and helpless. So when I read it, it was really her side that I picked up on first, and how she felt, just because of being a mum myself.
Yeah, no, it's very honest. Other feelings that were around?
For me, there's a lot in this about what Alan tried to do sort of as the accident was taking place.
Yeah.
And I think that has a huge bearing on the situation, the fact that he purposely tried to avoid that built-up residential area. And I think that has a huge bearing on how we are going to have to interact with him because of those choices that he made for other people.
So I think there's well identified there. I think there should be a predominant feeling of being shocked by this. It is shocking for lots and lots of reasons. It is deeply sad because there is no going back to how life was. So there is sadness, there is grief in this scenario. I think there's been some honest admission as to how that leaves us feeling that actually we're aware of quite significant tensions and conflict of focus. Very honest admission from Kerry that actually rather than focusing on the patient because of the resonance with your own experience, it's easier to identify, or at least first identify, with the mother. And there's no judgment in any of that, and I think it's really important that we hear that. You know, we have to acknowledge that there is a cost in pastoral care, that other people's situations do impact us. The skill is to be able to name it, to acknowledge it, and then park it to one side, because actually we need somewhere else to deal with our stuff. But we can't be there for the other person if we haven't already created that space by clearing our stuff to one side, not permanently, but as a temporary measure. You've already hinted at some of the pastoral need. Let's just try and pull some of those out. What do you think there's a whole range, as I think you've already picked up, whole range of pastoral needs here. Let's just try and name some of those.
I would want to know what Alan wants first, because we've heard what the sisters want, we've heard what the mum wants.
Okay.
but we haven't really heard what he wants. But obviously he sort of dropped that sort of the bomb word, as it were, of it's I've been to hell. I would want to know, what does he mean to that? I mean, is he making sort of medieval associations of fire and hell? Is he feeling trapped? I mean, someone who's gone from being a professional pilot to sort of being in need of quite serious medical care, he's a very independent person. He suddenly had that all taken away from him. So I'm wondering, does he mean that in the spiritual sense? Does he mean that in the psychological? I would assume certainly in the emotional sense. But again, I don't want to sort of put my assumptions on him. So really we need to hear what he's thinking, what he's experiencing, to be able to gauge the best response as well. Because how he's feeling and what he's experiencing, I think will then have a heavy influence on how we might approach the medical staff and also his mother.
Yeah.
For me, that there is another need that I don't think we've voiced so far, and I think there's a pastoral need around the medical staff as well. We read in the information that we've got that the sister has asked us to speak to us, and that there is that whole feeling that they are trying to do their best with somebody in a situation that it doesn't sound from what we have they've had anybody in that situation, such a serious situation. And I think we just need to be aware, as well as Alan and as well as his mother, that there are other people involved in this, particularly the immediate medical care staff.
Yeah, absolutely, that they're at their limit in lots of different ways.
Yes.
Yeah, well noticed. What other pastoral needs are in that?
So it says here that the mother is a member of the congregation, so this might have consequences into the community. They probably know Alan, they might have known since he was a little boy, and there'll be an emotional response there as well. I mean, you don't know how many people are sort of indirectly involved in this. Stuart, when you're talking about the healthcare professionals there, it's probably reasonable to assume there might at least be a part-time chaplain there, so you don't know what their role might be in this. So this might be a good exercise in actually sort of liaising with other people and actually just making sure all bases are covered. But also being very aware of what's going on in the background, because you also don't know, there's a reference here to a divorce. Yeah. You don't know the backstory to these relationships. So there's obviously baggage there beforehand, which will then feed into this.
And she's got she might not have, if she is divorced, but she might not have any other support. It might be just the church that she has.
And building onto that, it's perfectly possible. We have no mention of siblings here. No. He could be her only child, and therefore he could be all she has left. Yeah. And so this idea of he's coming to live with me is sort of protecting him and herself, because that's all she has.
Yeah, I think what we've named is one of the tensions of this pastoral situation and lots of situations, that we just don't know all the details. Or you've sort of gone into the middle of it, and you're getting one perspective from the sister, one perspective from the mother. Alan just seems to be totally lost in it. And I think part of our initial pastoral response has to be trying to hear Alan properly, trying to hear the mother properly, because this is great, but actually we need those deep conversations, and to give people the space to be honest about the situations and to help them work through, like Alan's mother's, it's obviously become wrapped up in her divorce and in her loneliness or something. I think that's where I would want to start, is in creating space with those groups, the staff.
In terms of Alan and his mother, there's something in here that actually immediately sets off alarm bells for me, where she says she's not sure if Alan's a person of faith or not. That's an odd thing not to know about your child. Maybe I'm making an assumption here as both someone's child and as a parent, but
he is in his 40s though, isn't he? He's not 10 or anything.
But it would seem strange. It just seems strange that she would be unsure, because for example, it would be easy for her to say, he doesn't really have a faith, or he's not a practicing Christian. But that's a very, very vague response, a way of answering it. She's not sure either way. So again, that implies some baggage there, or some information that would probably be quite helpful that we don't have.
it certainly appears, doesn't it, that the first sort of action is going to involve a huge amount of listening.
Yeah.
That listening that isn't there to solve, it's there to learn and just to listen to people's stories.
Well, that's it. You can see it says that the conversation focuses around the fact that he is still staring death in the face. He doesn't. The conversation, all he is on about is death and he's been to hell, and so he is focusing solely on that. I don't suppose he's even worrying about where he's going to live or anything. Is he going to live? It seems to be that they're all worrying about these little peripheral things, and there's a big issue here, and no one's worrying about this. They're all worrying about whose house is he going to live in, or unit. But
in the moment.
He is in the moment. It's his life. This is him. This is not someone else's story. This is his story, right there.
So that leads us on, I think, to the third one, which is to identify some fairly obvious theological issues in this scenario, which are
hell being the obvious one. So the nature of life and death. There's also a sense in which reconciliation with what has happened in some way occurs. So this horrific incident has happened, and in some way these people need to be reconciled to it, because, as you said, it can't be changed. This is something that they will have to live with the rest of their lives. So that there needs to be that process of reconciliation. There's also a sort of sense of unity, almost family in that sort of theological sense, because we've got elements, like I said, of the congregation, of more immediate connections, of sort of professional relationships. So that's sort of synonymous with the sense in which we're talking about unity and reconciliation. So how those two work together.
And there's a key question, I think, about identity here. What does it mean to be the mother of a 40-year-old? This 40-year-old who's had this tragic accident, and what does it mean for him to allow himself to be his mother's son, to receive care, but the tensions of our identity. And clearly, like you say, there's information missing in, it seems, from the mother's account of her son. Perhaps there is a genuine need for those two to be reconciled. And I'm fascinated by Alan's faith identity as well, his mother's unsureness, and yet him using these deeply theological categories like hell, or language of even staring death in the face, to me strikes of a sort of Christian mindset, even if not Christian language. So I'd really want to ask those questions of identity, I think, as well.
There's also, thinking of just the wider thing, especially around those caring for him, there's theology around suffering. I mean, Alan says he's still staring death in the face, and it's been 6 months. So he's been staring death in the face for 6 months, and there's sort of that idea around where God is in suffering, and all that sort of stuff.
Because the case study, it says that the Burns unit have never treated such a severely injured patient who has survived this long. Those words, survived this long, it sounds as if he has a shorter life expectancy of some description, or possibly. So that needs to be addressed as well, really, doesn't it?
There's the idea, taking again from your idea of identity, Dominic, there's that identity of Alan before the accident, and Alan working out who is Alan post-accident.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is huge, and possibly will tie into a lot of how he is feeling. So who is he now that his life has changed so dramatically?
But he's gone from a professional pilot, independent, life is owned, obviously, to being disfigured and disabled. I mean, that's a massive change in his life.
Yes.
So some significant theological themes there, well identified. our theology of heaven and hell, our theology of what it means to live, and a theology of our identity. So having identified all our own feelings, the pastoral needs of a range of people in this story, identified some fairly significant theological themes, if we just focus on Alan, what might you be wanting to enable in a conversation to help address some of those key themes which I think you've identified quite correctly today? And perhaps bearing in mind Patterson and Woodward's definition that practical theology is a place where religious belief, Nick reminded us, I think, about tradition with the need for reconciliation, and where the tradition and practice meet contemporary experiences, questions and actions, and conduct a dialogue that's mutually enriching, intellectually critical and practically transforming.
It's that safe space to listen, but for Alan to talk as openly and as freely as he feels that he can, which may not be on that deeper level initially, but just give him the space for somebody to listen to him, which really sounds as if that might not be happening.
Well, I think Sam quite rightly identified there's some questions here about God and suffering. Yeah. What do we think about that statement, I have been to hell? I mean, that's the starting point, isn't it? Yeah? It means, you know, there's some questions there which Kerry identified about life and death. You know, where is God in suffering? What do we understand about heaven and hell? And we may have different understandings in the room, and that's okay. That's what this is about.
I was going to say, do we need to sort of suspend our personal take on that question and actually listen to what Alan's understanding of that term is first? Because sort of imposing our personal perspectives might be more damaging than helpful in that particular situation.
Yeah, because we could take it that he's talking about metaphor and try to dig into that, and then actually we discover he means that quite literally, which puts a whole different spin on things.
And why would he think that that wasn't a metaphor and that that was literal? Where's the connecting points?
It's sort of around his accident. He's saying he's staring death in the face. If he felt like he had literally been right to the brink, he'd been somewhere and come back, sort of thing.
Just in popular culture, what's the connecting point between hell and what he's been through?
Fire.
The fire, absolutely. It's very graphic, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very graphic.
Plus, it was obviously burning for quite some time because the emergency services couldn't get to him quickly, so he thought he was dying in flames, obviously. Yeah. So that is the popular culture of hell. That's what the picture is. You think of hell, you think of flames, and I mean.
And what did Sam pick up on that's implicit in the words in that little phrase, I have been to hell? Sam changed the image just slightly, but not incorrectly. What did you say?
I'm trying to remember now. There's a thing about...
What was the movement?
I think he feels like he's been to the brink and been somewhere and
Yes.
come back.
Yes. So been to the brink and come back. So what's the starting point for the conversation?
What does he mean by that phrase?
You know, I've been to hell is focused in the past. He's not there now. So you've got one tiny little grain of hope. Yes, it's worth exploring what it means to have been to hell, but where is he now in relation to that experience?
He hasn't stated he's there now, is he?
No.
which I suppose if we were going to think of his situation within the grief cycle, puts him in a very different place on that cycle of grief. It puts him in that place where there is the possibility, he might see that possibility of moving on. I can't remember the exact places on that grief cycle. but it definitely puts him in that position, or appears to put him in that position of taking that step forward in that cycle.
And I suppose it's being there to offer him that, to journey with him through, to maybe even make him aware, like you just did to us. Oh, well, yes, you're not there now. That's going to be a huge. I would have thought to him, if I was in that situation and I'd said that, and someone said, "But that means that you don't think you're there now. You think you're." That would be a lift, wouldn't it, of some description? So.
And yet he's still staring death in the face. I think one thing I would really want to try and do in this situation is to allow him to sit in for a time in that pain and in staring, because it sounds like his mother is thinking about the future. The medical staff have a particular agenda about moving him on and rehabilitation. I'd actually want to give permission, give space to actually grieve for what had happened, to stare death in the face together. And I think to affirm that voice has a place in our faith, I'd want to talk to him about. And for me, the minute I heard I have been to hell, I can't help but think of Good Friday and Holy Saturday, and the sense that actually we have a faith in a God who has been to hell. And I think I'd want to provide a space where we could honour that voice of fear and pain and hurt, and not rush to a solution too quickly. So yes, say you're not in hell anymore, but allow him to talk about that, to have space to, because I think in voicing it we can begin to be transformed, because we name our fears and everyone else seems to be rushing towards solution.
Exactly,
and
yes.
future.
He's not there yet. He's not even. He hasn't even mentioned his future. He's still. Yeah.
I mean, I want to reflect what you said, and absolutely, I think you're spot on there. But these are the phrases that are used in conversation with someone who's come in who's ordained. So I'm wondering if this is his sort of way of trying to loosely rationalise what he's experienced, giving voice to something he can't give voice to, in a way that someone with a colour on might understand, if that makes sense. So he might be using a language that he perceives we might understand to give voice to something. That's a possibility that sort of occurred to me as well when I was reading this.
Yeah, I think it also just points to the fact that Christian metaphors remain in those dark moments. You know, people say, "Well, I prayed," or "I went to hell," or "I feel like I'm in heaven." I think there's that fabulous book, isn't there? I can't remember who. It's "By Metaphors We Live By," and so many of them are so deeply Christian. So I'm aware, we can't read faith off his use of theological words, but I think they give us a space into the drama of his emotions and his feelings, and actually to sort of layer that with the story, our story, the Christian story, is quite powerful. And if he clearly has a faithful mother, those stories resonate, and I think I'd want to help him use especially the story of Good Friday and Easter to try and make sense of that experience, even if we're not assuming a faith. These are it's just common language.
Thank you. I think that's all we've got time for this afternoon, but well identified and absolutely right that we start where he is and use his words, and we don't try and put faith in his mouth. We don't try and put him somewhere that he isn't. I think you picked up the nuances well, and that's whatever the conversation, they're not all as serious as this one, but we need to pick up the words that people are using. We need to notice their metaphor and the power that it holds for that person, and we need to use their words. So thank you.